In my last video, I showed you how to use the gate plugin on your drum tracks in Presonus Studio One. In today's video, it's all about EQ. So let's jump into Studio One and start EQing some drums. So here I've got my drum tracks pulled up in Presonus Studio One. Where we left off was each of the kick, snare, and the two tom tracks had these gate plugins. All the settings are the same from when we left off on the last video. Let's take a listen to the drum set as a whole, and then we'll start EQing. All right, the first place I want to start is with the kick drum. So I'm going to go to my kick track. You can either do this on the side with the inspector view, or if you have the mix tab open at the bottom, just go to wherever you have your kick drum at, click the plus button. Next to inserts, scroll down to Presonus, and then within the Presonus folder, you have what's called Pro EQ. Now, the first thing I want to do with the kick drum is I want to solo it. So hit S on your keyboard. Whenever you solo a track, the only thing that you should be hearing in your headphones is that track. So with the kick drum soloed, it sounds like this. So I'm going to highlight a loop region here where I'm just hitting the kick drum over and over so that I can EQ it. If you're not familiar with any EQ at all, just a brief overview. Anywhere I go on the left side of the EQ plugin, this is going to be the low end. This is the stuff that's really thumpy. This is the bass frequencies. In the middle, we have the mids, both low mids and high mids in the green right here. And then the very top, kind of in the blue color, this is the treble, or these are the crispy details. Now, the first thing you'll probably want to do is pick up this yellow band, and I like to just click and drag and move it around, and I'm listening for where's the fundamental of whatever drum I'm mixing. So if I hit the play button, you're gonna hear the kick drum. I'm gonna move this yellow dot around all over the place, and I essentially wanna find out where the fundamental tone of the kick drum is. I'll tell you, usually it's around 60 hertz or so, between 60 and 80 down here, but you'll hear as I sweep across. All right, so that one's about 52 hertz, which is really cool. 52 hertz, it's gonna sound really pleasing, especially if you can hear it. You gotta have some sort of headphones on. You probably won't hear this much on just your cell phone for right now. But with the EQ, whenever I find the fundamental, that's usually an area I want to boost, but I don't wanna boost it that much. You can kind of do this to taste whatever sounds good with your kick drum. Again, your kick drum might be up at 80 hertz or 70 hertz or so. Just find where it sounds really thick and massive. I just wanna do a boost as it's playing. I'm gonna start off with something around 6 to 12 decibels, which is pretty extreme, but we'll do a before and after later on. All right, the next thing I wanna do is to cut some mud. So usually after I boost something, there's usually somewhere where we need to cut. So I'm gonna grab this orange band. If I just click this dot right here, I'm gonna do the same thing I did when I was trying to find the fundamental of the kick drum, but this time I'm looking for this kind of almost boxy sound. It's kind of like an inverted ball sound. I'm gonna hit play, you'll hear what I'm talking about. And then when I find it, I actually wanna cut that frequency out, which means we're gonna go below the median line right here. Hear how that kind of sounds a little bit nasally for a kick drum? I'm gonna cut that. You can hear now it sounds a lot more articulate and a little bit more hi-fi. Let's hit the play button. All right, that sounds pretty good. Now the next thing I want to look out for in the kick drum is the attack, the sound of the kick drum beater hitting that drum head. So let's search around up here in the frequencies. It's usually around 2K or so. You're gonna hear a clicky sound, almost like when you hear heavy metal drums. They use a lot of this frequency as well. Let's try to find that. Yeah, so this one is about 3.6K. I've got a little bit more click sound to it. I've got it boosted right now at about 12, which is pretty extreme, but let's just listen to the EQ before and then after. This is before EQ. After. Now there's going to be a volume difference, so it's up to you if you want to use this auto function that's on the Pro EQ. As soon as this is selected, it's going to level match or try to level match as best it can what the original track is without EQ. So let's see if they're volume matched pretty well. This is without and with. That sounds good to me. So I'm going to move on from the EQ drum. And again, just like what we did with the gate plugin, I can click and drag this EQ over to the snare drum. It'll copy all of my EQ settings onto the snare. But the snare drum definitely doesn't need to have the same effects as the kick drum, so I need to fine tune things. First of all, this green area up here of the snare drum, instead of it being the sound of the beater hitting the kick drum head, this is the area where I want to hear the stick hitting the top of the snare. Down here, about where we had our cut around 150 hertz or so, this is going to be much higher because typically with a snare drum in the mid-range, there's that same boxy sound, but it's shifted. It's a lot higher than the kick drum is. And then the low fundamental of the snare drum is not at 60 hertz or so. It's actually more up at about 120, something like that. So we'll search around for those frequencies, but essentially we've got the yellow is going to boost, orange is going to cut, and then we're going to use the green one to give us some more crispy high end on the snare drum. Okay. Let's start with the low end of the snare. I've got the snare soloed now, so we're just listening to the snare drum. Let's try and find the low fundamental. All right, that sounds pretty good there. Again, I'm not mixing with my eyes, so I will see the graph bars moving, but I'm listening to what I'm hearing in the headphones. And even though this is an egregious, this is really like 18, let's see, we've got about 18 decibels boosted on the snare drum low. I'm just going by what I hear. So let's take the orange now. We're trying to find that boxy region that we need to cut. You can hear how that sounds kind of inverted almost. Let's cut that out. All right, it sounds pretty tubby right now, so we need to add some crispiness. Let's find this green area up around 2 to 5K. It's usually it. All right, now on 5K, that sounded the most natural, so I've got that boosted about 12 decibels as well. One thing I want to say is when I'm making these videos, do I want you to copy my exact settings? No, I don't. But as I'm explaining things to you, like when I say we're looking for the fundamental of the snare drum, we're looking for the fundamental of the kick drum, that may or may not be the exact same frequencies that you're hearing on your kit because your drum set might be a different size, different model, all that kind of stuff. You're going to have to tweak these to your own specifications, but I do believe that you can take some of the philosophy behind how I'm mixing these drums and apply it to your situation. I usually want to boost wherever the fundamental is, so that comes across nice and strong. Usually above the fundamental, there's that nasally kind of like mid-range quality that we don't commonly hear on drums. And then there's some crispiness that we're going to boost in the treble as well. So that'll be particular to your set as well. On the snare drum, I want to start using what's called a low cut filter. So if I click this little dot, you can see that we now have a low cut engaged. And that low cut is going to be, we'll roll it all the way up to about 80 hertz or so. That should be fine for now. Let's take a listen to that. If you think 80 hertz is too high, you can also switch it over to 50 hertz as well. We're using a low cut on something like a snare drum. It's not because we don't want those frequencies to come across on the snare drum. It's just that we need to save room for the kick drum. Because remember the kick drum, we were boosting around that 60 to 80 hertz region. So on the snare drum, I don't want to hear like, my snare drum should not sound like a kick drum for the most part. But let's take a listen to before EQ on the snare drum now. And after. All right, that sounds more pleasing to me when I'm listening to it. Let's just take a listen now that we've got the kick and snare drum mixed with some gate plugins and some EQ plugins. Let's just hear how much of a difference that's making on the entire kit overall. So here is my drum set with the kick drum and snare drum EQ'd. And here's with our kick drum and snare drum EQ'd. That sounds a whole lot more professional to me, but we need to keep going. So let's go to our tom tracks. I'm going to click and drag my snare drum track over. Same principle applies. I've got the rack tom right here, which I'm clearly hitting at the very beginning of this passage. So I want to isolate the same kind of stuff. I want to find where's the fundamental of my rack tom, where do I want to boost some high end, and where do I want to cut some of the muddiness out of the tom. Let's hit play. This is with the snare drum settings. Let's just hear what it sounds like. That sounds pretty good to me. So I ended up moving the low cut down to 50 Hertz. My yellow band is around 98 Hertz. That's boosting about 13 dB. My orange band is cutting about 12 dB at 348 Hertz. And then green has been shifted up a little bit to 5.3K, where I'm boosting about 6 decibels as well. Let's go ahead and while we're at it, let's get the floor tom EQ'd. We'll go back and listen to the before and after in just a little bit, but here's the floor tom. For the most part, I like the floor tom to be EQ'd similarly to the rack tom. I was going to adjust the low cut filter on this because the floor tom definitely has a lot more low end than the rack tom, but I still don't want my floor tom to sound like my kick drum. I don't want them taking up the same space. So a 50 Hertz cut on a floor tom is going to have more impact than a 50 Hertz cut on a rack tom, but I really like the frequencies that are already being boosted and cut. So with all that being said, let's take a listen to both of the toms together. This is before any EQ. I've just got the floor tom and the rack tom soloed. Here they are with EQ. We're definitely getting some volume difference there, but I'm okay with it because in our next video, we're going to talk about compression. So all that being said, we've got the kick, snare, and the 2 tom tracks EQ'd. Let's take a listen to the entire kit and see how it's affecting the overall sound of the drums. And here it is, just to remember, this is what it sounds like with no EQ on any of the drums. And here it is after. All right, now we need to address the hi-hat and the ride cymbal. The ride cymbal doesn't get hit a lot on this, but when I'm using these 2 microphones, which would typically be known as overhead mics, meaning they're over the top of my drum kit on the cymbals, I'm actually using these as underheads. So I have a microphone pointed underneath, pointed up at my hi-hat. I've got a microphone underneath my ride cymbal pointed up at the ride cymbal. Whatever processing I do to the hi-hat, I want to try to carry it over to the ride cymbal because typically these 2 things are almost like a stereo pair. I don't want to mistreat one, be overly aggressive with low end or high end, and then not do it with the other, because as you're going to hear in the hi-hat and the ride cymbal microphones, they're picking up a lot of the kit in general. So whatever I do to one, I'm going to try to apply the same principles to the other. But when it comes to cymbals, I'm going to add the Pro EQ. I'm not going to carry over the settings that we used earlier. I'm going to activate this red band. If you just click the red circle, here we are on the hi-hat track. I'll try to find a passage where we're using a lot of hi-hat cymbal. The first thing I want to do is essentially cut all of the low end out of my cymbal tracks as possible, because the hi-hat cymbal and my ride cymbal, they're not meant to have low tones to them. They do have a distinct low sound. I'm using K Constantinople cymbals. They do sound a lot darker than most cymbals out there, but typically with cymbals, I'm going to remove this low cut filter. I'm going to move it up even as high as like 500 Hertz or so. Let's take a listen to what that does to the hi-hat track. So here's my hi-hat track soloed with no EQ at all. As you can hear, there's just not a lot of low end on it anyway. If I engage the EQ filter, that sounds really crispy and pretty harsh, and if it were just by itself, then no, I wouldn't want to use this drastic of an EQ. But I know that in context of the rest of the drums, you're not going to be perceiving this as overtly crispy. It's going to be just a hi-hat cymbal in the context. So let's take the same thing. I'm going to drag and drop it over to the ride cymbal as well. So we'll listen to those two together. Sounds crispy, sounds thin, and I'm not saying that they're gonna stay with this EQ move, but let's listen to in context with the rest of the drum kit so we can hear how crispy do they really sound. Not that bad, okay? To me, when you have the kick drum, snare drum, the two rack toms, when you have these underhead mics and you have a room mic as well, it's not as noticeable if you're gonna make your hi-hat or ride cymbals extra crispy. In fact, it cleans up the mix because the more we can filter out on the low end, we're gonna save that for the kick drum, save it for the snare drum and the floor tom. With that being said, let's listen to our room track. It's been a long time. We haven't done any processing to the room mic. It's just one that's this TLM 103 that's sitting here in the room with me, just meant to give a little bit of ambience, but not be overtly reverberant. Let's take a listen to it without any processing. Yeah, the only thing I'm hearing that I might want to address with the room mic is a little bit of tubbiness in the mid-range, because the mid-range is really what's going to make this track or this mix sound kind of muddy. It's going to be in the mids. So let's address that. If I can isolate as it's playing, I'll try to scoop around and see if we can find where is that kind of muddy sound coming from. Kind of a plasticky sound. I just want to cut some of that just so we have a more clear or defined room mic. Last thing is there's a little bit of harshness coming from the cymbals, so I'm going to try and tame those a little bit with this high band frequency. And a lot of this may sound weird right now, but just like when we were doing the gate plugin video, you might watch that gate plugin video and thought, oh, these drums sound terrible. Well, the more you mix, the more you go through these steps and stages, you start to anticipate what it's going to sound like in the end, because I can know right now that that room mic is going to give me problems unless I address that mid-range, okay? So it's about anticipating. I'm going to be headed toward compression. So compression is going to take the dynamics of this, it's going to squash it a little bit, and then we're going to add some effects. We're going to add some distortion. We're going to add some reverb or some ambience to these drum tracks. It's still got a ways to go, but I can know it sounds good because I'm addressing each of them along the way. So here is my overall drum track sound. I'm going to start with no gate, no EQ, take a listen, and then I'll enable all the plugins later on. Here it is with it on. Again, I've been mentioning this in the video that this is a part of a series of videos where we're learning how to mix drums in Presonus Studio One. If you haven't watched the gate plugin video on drums, make sure you watch that one. That was kind of part one. This has been part two with EQing the drums. Our next video is going to be on compressing the drums. As we compress and then as we add effects like distortion and reverb, that's really going to bring out a lot of dramaticness to these drums. So stay tuned for that. My name is Chris Green. If you enjoy this kind of stuff, music production, tips with Presonus Studio One, I want to encourage you to hit the like and subscribe buttons for more videos just like this, and I'll see you next time.